we're learning. They're on our YouTube channel and Facebook, just so you guys know. So CSM YouTube, I don't know what it's called, but it's CSM. So just a little shout out. But, all right, here's what we're going to do. Now, you guys are going to play some tug of war. I'm just kidding. You're not doing that. Esau, you can probably come up like over here. Okay, and you guys can like kind of pull the rope a little tight. You can just kind of let it loose. All right, so now all of us, all right, you guys are doing a great job. You don't get any tiny trophies for this, but you get life points. You each get 10 points. So this is going to represent, you're going to represent life, okay? So that's cool. You represent death. I'm sorry.
It's even more beautiful.
And then this just represents life after death, okay? So all of us right now, like that are listening, we are living right here, right? In this realm with life. And most of us, we're somewhere along this line, like we don't know when we're going to pass, but we're living here. And we don't really think a whole lot about this guy, about death. And we don't really think a lot about what happens afterwards unless you know someone who's passed away recently, or maybe you get really ill. Then we start to think about, like this guy. Not Esau, but death. Now, last year in February, my grandma-in-law, so Piper's grandma, she passed away. And I remember she had a seizure, and she was put on life support in the hospital. And so Piper, she flew down, and then it got real serious. So then I drove down, and I was in the hospital, and it was like, her name's Dolores, so it's like she was like right here next to death, right? And it's not something you think about, and I've never been up close to someone who was on life support. I've heard about it. I've never seen it, right? So we're sitting in the hospital for a few days, and it's like we just don't know when she's going to pass, but it's crazy because she's had this whole life, and now she's like in her 70s, and then she comes close, and I'll never forget when she was on life support, and it was about that time, and her breath started getting heavier, but there was more time in between each breath, and it was a surreal experience. And I'll never forget when she breathed her last breath. There was many seconds between the second to last and the very last. When she breathed her last breath, like you could just tell that like the soul within her left her body. Like that was it. Like I saw Dolores go from life, and she passed through this doorway into eternity. Like I saw that. Like I saw the actual thing took place. And I remember it just made me, like it was surreal, because you're like, you don't think about death a whole lot, and you don't think about eternity a whole lot. We tend to think about life. But when you have instances like when you're in the hospital on someone's deathbed, which some of you might have had that experience, it's like it's unreal, because it makes you think about this, okay? Now, I need one more volunteer, another mature soul. All right, let's go. Noah, you're so mature. Come on, Noah. All right. Hey, that was an immature comment. All right, come here. Okay, so Dylan's life, Esau is death, and Sam is forever, okay? Forever. Noah is going to represent Job, okay? So you were just born, so go to your life, okay? You were born. Give us some baby sounds. That's like a cat. That's like a cat. Come on, for real. Okay, whatever. All right, so now, he's going to start walking slowly, so hold on to the rope, and you're going to walk slowly, okay? And when I say stop, you're going to stop, okay? Okay, Job? Yes. Okay, so you walk. Slop. I said slop, not stop. Shop. Keep going.
Mom.
Keep going. Stop right there, okay? So look at the crowd. Don't wave, because you're Job.
Hi, life.
All right, so Job, at our point in this text, Job has lived a good life, and all of a sudden he loses everything, and he lost his health, and he's wrestling with things. But in our text tonight, it's like he's going to face this guy right here. He's going to look at death, and he's going to say, you see how much rope there's not a lot of rope left, right? He's like, I'm coming near to death, but he's like, I still don't feel like I'm in the right with God. I still don't want to have hope. And he's like, I want hope for the rest of eternity. He doesn't really know what it looks like, but he's like, I want hope. Sorry, I got to squeeze back here. He's like, I want hope all the way past death. But the only way for him to have hope for eternity is to have hope before death. And so in our text tonight, it's like he's facing death in a way, and he's almost like, hey, there's not a lot of rope left before I enter the grave, so there's this sense of urgency. He's like, I need hope now, because I'm about to enter through this doorway, and I'm going to breathe my last breath, and I need to just enter through, and this is forever. And so here he is tonight. This is our text, and he's going to look for hope, and we're going to see Job's hope, your boy Noah, Job's hope, that is going to show us the hope that we have before death. Like, if we're going to have hope after death, we got to have it before death. But like, what? You're not scared? Okay. Can we hear the baby cry again? Okay, that was very unenthusiastic, all right? But we're going to see the hope that Job begins to have, and like it grows, and then we're going to see how that points to the hope that we can have. So you four mature gentlemen, I just want to say great job. Can you guys give them all a clap? Okay, I will take the rope. You guys can go back to your seats. Thank you. Wait, what? Yes. Okay. All right, so again, he feels he's near the end of his life. He's looking for hope. It's urgent. And again, we're going to see time and time again how our text tonight points us to Jesus. So here's our big idea on your sermon guides. You can write this down. It's this. Ready? There is no hope after death until you trust in the one who defeated death. There is no hope after death until you trust in the one who defeated death. So Job, he's going to begin to want some hope. He wants hope after death. He's kind of looking for this mediator who we know as Jesus, but it's like he's getting a clear picture of the gospel, more and more, but we get it, right? To have hope after death is to trust in the one who defeated death. And so as we go through our text tonight, remember where Job is at in his life on that rope. The rope's getting short. He's near death. Or he feels that at least, and he's looking for hope. And we're going to see how this text points us to the cross and points us to Jesus. But to start out, we have to start. Do you remember the first of Eliphaz? The first of Job's three friends? My bad. I didn't actually. Yeah. Okay. Well, Eliphaz is going to speak, and he's going to kind of say the same thing that the other friends have been saying. And so here's our first point that we're going to learn. Ready? A religion of morality. It leaves no room for undeserved suffering. Okay? A religion of morality leaves no room for undeserved suffering. Now, can someone just tell me kind of what this belief system that the friends have? All right, Esau, what is it? Do good, get good, bad, get bad. Exactly. They're like, hey, if you do good in life, good things happen. If you do bad things in life, bad things happen. We know that's the case with certain things. Like if you go to jail because you stole something, you're there because you stole. But there's other things in life that happen. You're like, Job was a good man, but he suffered. Why is that, right? And so this religion of morality, based on sowing and reaping, this moral order of the universe, Eliphaz basically says, hey, there's no room in this house, right? There's no room for undeserved suffering. Job, what you say doesn't make sense. Your experience doesn't fit. There's no room. It makes no sense. There's no grace, any of that. So, as we'll see, this is the second time Eliphaz speaks to Job. And if you remember in the earlier chapters, his tone is going to get a bit more harsh. He gets a bit more short, it seems like more unloving and more harsh. But we're going to see what he says to Job. Because remember, Job's defending himself. He's talking. And here's what Eliphaz says in verse 1. It says, Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, here's what he says to Job. Should a wise man answer with windy knowledge and fill his belly with the east wind? Should he argue in unprofitable talk or in words with which he can do no good? So he's basically saying, Job, your words have no weight. They have, what you're saying doesn't mean anything. But remember, this religion of morality that he believes about sowing and reaping, that's how God strictly operates the universe, this idea of undeserved suffering, it doesn't fit in with that idea, right? Because Job, if he's suffering, it's because he deserves it. That's what Eliphaz thinks. And so this whole idea of undeserved suffering, Job's experience, his words, it's like you think Eliphaz would get it, and he'd have some sympathy and be like, oh, Job, tell me more about that. Let's talk through that. Maybe there is this idea of undeserved suffering, but it's like his religion of morality, this good and bad, this is what you receive, reaping and sowing. There's no room for undeserved suffering. There's no room for Job's life or his words. And so based off of that, he draws some pretty harsh conclusions about Job. Look at verse 4. He says, but you, Job, this is crazy, right? He says, but you are doing away with the fear of God and hindering meditation before God. So he makes some statements about God, and then he draws some wrong conclusions and says, Job, you don't even fear God. You don't have reverence and humility and love for God anymore. And you're like, the only reason Job is wrestling with these things in his pain is because he fears God, right? He wants to be in the right before God, but Eliphaz states, you don't fear God anymore. Like, that's a pretty cold statement to say from a friend of yours, but that's what Eliphaz says to Job. And now he continues in verse 5. This is great. He just accuses Job. It's like he's just attacking him. He says, "For your iniquity teaches your mouth, and you choose the tongue of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, and not I. Your own lips testify against you." Remember, this religion of morality, there's no room for undeserved suffering. Like, they just can't coexist in the same world together. It rejects this idea of undeserved suffering. So when Job is saying, hey, I'm in pain, right? I'm struggling. I don't know what I'm doing. I long for the mediator and a resurrection. Eliphaz sees that as him covering up lies. Like, he's using these words to cover up the guilt that he feels. But the reality is, we already know Job was truly not perfect, not sinless, but he was a blameless man before God, a man of sacrifice and integrity. And so Eliphaz thinks he's trying to cover up some like secret sin or some guilt that he has, but he's not. But again, Eliphaz's belief system doesn't allow for such thing as undeserved suffering. And so now he's looking at a man who's suffering undeservedly, and he's accusing him. Now, look at what he says next. He kind of like, you know when people say things and you're just like, that was a dig, like that kind of hurt me, you know what I'm saying? Like your siblings or like your close friends. This is what he does to Job. He says, "Are you the first man who was born? Or were you brought forth before the hills? Have you listened in the counsel of God, and do you limit wisdom to yourself? What do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that is not clear to us? Both the gray-haired and the aged are among us, older than your father." He basically undermines the age of Job. He's like, hey, were you born like the first one ever born? He's like, are you really that old? And then it's like, you know who's among us? It's the ones who have gray hair and are aged. It's like he undermines Job's age because he's young, but then he basically says, hey, but I'm part of the wise people because we're older and we have gray hair and all these things. It's like, that's messed up, right? He's just undercutting Job. And then he continues, and this is, again, another accusation against Job that's pretty cold, okay? In verse 13 or verse 11, he says, "Are the comforters or the comforts of God too small for you, or the word that deals gently with you? Why does your heart carry you away, and why do your eyes flash?" Ready for this? This is the accusation. "That you turn your spirit against God and bring such words out of your mouth." He's like, Job, remember, undeserved suffering has no place in a world where God operates the world strictly according to justice of right and wrong. It's that black and white. And so he's like, Job, you're not even turning to God. You're turning away from God. And we know Job is wrestling with these things, and he wants hope, not because he's turning away from God. He's actually turning to God, and he wants to be, that's his deepest desire, right, is to be in relationship with God. But Eliphaz is just wrongly accusing him. You're like, dude, that's not a cool thing to do as a friend. But then he continues, and this is kind of his last statement before he gives an illustration. He says this to Job. He says, "What is man that he can be pure, or he who is born of a woman that he can be righteous? Behold, God puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight. How much less one who is abominable and corrupt, a man who drinks injustice like water?" He's like, Job, listen, you say all these things, how you're right before God, how you're innocent and blameless, all these things, and you're suffering undeservedly. But he's like, no one's in the right before God. Like, no one, right? He's like, you drink injustice like someone drinks water. And now he's going to give an illustration like of the day, like a traditional illustration of someone who's wicked. Someone who is, right, you reap what you sow. So someone who's planting bad, who's now harvesting these evil things. And he's going to give this traditional example in the rest of this chapter. So I'm going to read it kind of quickly. But here he goes in verse 17. He says, "I will show you, hear me, and what I have seen I will declare, what wise men have told without hiding it from their fathers, to whom alone the land was given, and no stranger passed among them." He's like, Job, I'm about to give you an example that has been passed down from generation to generation, a traditional thing. He's like, this is the wicked man. He's going to first talk about the wicked man's fears, and then the fate of the wicked. So the fear of the wicked and the fate. So here's the fear. He says, "The wicked man writhes in pain all his days, through all the years that are laid up for the ruthless. Dreadful sounds are in his ears. In prosperity the destroyer will come upon him. He does not believe that he will return out of darkness, and he is marked for the sword. He wanders abroad for bread, saying, where is it? He knows that a day of darkness is ready at his hand. Distress and anguish terrify him, and they prevail against him like a king ready for battle." He's basically saying, if you are a wicked person, you are going to have fear, like fill you. You're going to be scared. You're going to be anxious. You're going to be waking up in a cold sweat. And he's like, Job, you are feeling that way. and you have this anxiety and these fears and you have these cold sweats and you can't sleep, he's like, the bad feelings you have are just showing the bad character and the bad heart that you have. Because remember, Job's feeling all these things, right? He's struggling, he's in pain, and Eliphaz is saying, hey, you know what? There's no room in my belief system for undeserved suffering, and so the reason you're feeling all those things is because you're actually wicked and you're doing wrong. And then he talks about the fate of the wicked. So I'm going to read the rest of the chapter and just listen to what he says about what happens to wicked people in verse 25. He says, because, this is why you feel that way, because he, the wicked person, stretched out his hand against God and defies the Almighty, running stubbornly against him with a thickly bossed shield, because he has covered his face with his fat and gathered fat upon his waist, and has lived in desolate cities and houses that none should inhabit, which are ready to become heaps of ruins. And so now we're going to see the result of that. He says he will not be rich, his wealth will not endure, nor will his possessions spread over the earth. He will not depart from darkness. The flame will dry up his shoots, and by the breath of his mouth he will depart. Let him not trust in emptiness, deceiving himself, for emptiness will be his payment. It will be paid in full before his time, and his branch will not be green. He will shake off his unripe grape like a vine, and cast off his blossom like the olive tree. For the company of the godless is barren, and fire consumes the tents of bribery. They conceive trouble and give birth to evil, and their womb prepares deceit. He's like, Job, there's the fear of the wicked which you have, and there's the fate of the wicked which you're experiencing. And we know, remember, that's why I said earlier, chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Job is like so important to understand, because we have to establish Job was truly a righteous and godly man. And there's no room for undeserved suffering in Eliphaz's belief system. And so rather than him acknowledging, yeah, Job, you are truly in the right before God, but now you're suffering undeservedly, there's no room for that. So rather, he says, Job, you have the fear of a wicked person, so your bad feelings show your bad character, and you're suffering the fate of the wicked. So because you're harvesting these bad things in your life, you must have done something wrong to deserve losing all your children, your bad health, everything, right? So again, we know that a religion of morality, this reaping and sowing, this moral order, has no room for undeserved suffering. But remember what I said earlier, right? This book is going to drive us straight to the cross, straight to Jesus. With Eliphaz, if there is no room for undeserved suffering, there is no room in this world for Jesus, right? If there's no room for undeserved suffering, there's no room for Jesus. If there's no room for Jesus, who, sinless man, who bore all the sin upon himself, who was punished not because of his sin, but because of ours, then there's no hope, there's no salvation. And so undeserved suffering, we have to understand that it makes room for undeserved grace. Because without undeserved suffering, we don't have Jesus. And so the reason why Eliphaz, his counsel and his, whatever you want to call it, to Job is so harsh is because it lacks grace. It lacks the gospel. It's this black and white moral order of this universe. You reap what you sow. There's no grace involved. And so it's like he's taking salt and he's pouring it on Job's wounds because there's no grace. And so we're going to see again throughout the rest of our text how Job, it's like he begins to see this picture of the gospel. He begins to see this need more and more for a mediator. And we're going to see this. And here's our second point. Okay? Point number 2 is this. That undeserved suffering makes room for undeserved grace. So again, Eliphaz, there's no room in his belief system for undeserved suffering. But what we see in the life of Job, and what we see more clearly in the life of Jesus, is that undeserved suffering makes room for undeserved grace. It's like this whole book. Job's friends and Job. It's like more his friends. They're trying to figure out, Job, why are you suffering? It doesn't make sense. You don't deserve it, but you're suffering, so it must be because you did something wrong. And they say that over and over and over again. But if they could just zoom out and see the big picture of the Bible, which they're like, right, they don't have the ability back then. And Jesus had not yet come. But if they could just see what we saw, and they had the whole counsel of God, they would see that Job's example points ahead to the life of Jesus and the work of Jesus. Job was a great man, but Jesus was even greater. Job suffered severely, but Jesus suffered even more severely. He suffered undeservedly, but the only reason why he did that was so that we could have undeserved grace. And so this whole idea of undeserved suffering, it allows this undeserved grace to be received by us. And so let's look at what Job says to his friends, because that, like, imagine you're hurting and someone just says, hey, you're hurting because you done messed up, right? And maybe you didn't have anything to do with that, and they're like, this is why. Let me explain it to you. So Job has some words to say to his friends. So here's what he says in verse 1. It says, then Job answered and said, I have heard many such things, and look at what he calls them. He says, miserable comforters are you all. He's like, you guys are not comforting me at all with your religious jargon. He's like, and your belief system. He's like, you guys are miserable comforters. And then he continues. And he says this, he says, shall windy words have an end? Or what provokes you that you answer? I also could speak as you do. If you were in my place, I could join words together against you and shake my head at you. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and solace of my lips would assuage your pain. He's like, if I speak, my pain is not assuaged. And if I forbear, how much of it leaves me? He's like, if we were to switch positions, right, and you were suffering and I was fine, he's like, I could be like you. And I could just shout all these things and say, yeah, you deserved it. But he's like, you're a miserable comforter. That's not helping at all. He's like, I could actually bring words of comfort, but his friends aren't bringing that. He's like, just walk a mile in my shoes and you'll see what it's like. But now he's about to explain something about how he feels in regards to God, how he feels God is treating him. And in a moment, we're going to show you a video that it's like 30 seconds, but it's just going to kind of show you what Job might have been feeling. And so we're going to read that, and we're going to see what he says at the end. But this video is going to show us kind of what our next 11 verses are going to show us. You guys ready? Okay, Hannah, can you play that video? This is like Job right now. That's kind of how he feels, okay? He's going to be like, hey, I feel like I just got beat up. And then he's like, but then this happened. And then he's like, okay, I thought I had some relief, but then this happened. And I feel like God did this to me. And then these people did this. And then this happened, this happened. It's like he's going down this hill, just getting beat up. And you're like, okay, I think he had enough. He's gone down 10 feet. He goes down another 10 feet. And he's just going to keep describing this I'm getting beat up and I'm rolling over. And we're going to see what he says and what he describes. So I'm going to read it for you and just picture that in your mind. And then we'll see what he says at the end. So this is kind of the suffering he feels. This is how he feels how God is treating him, starting in verse 7. He says this. He says, surely now God has worn me out. He has made desolate all my company. He's like, you guys make me feel like I'm on an island. That's what he just said. And then he says, and God has shriveled me up, which is a witness against me, and my leanness has risen up against me. It testifies to my face. Check it, just see the pain that he's feeling. He says, he has torn me in his wrath and hated me. He has gnashed his teeth at me. My adversary sharpens his eye against me. So if you read this carefully, it's basically, he's almost saying God is hostile towards him. He says, men have gaped at me with their mouth. They have struck me insolently on the cheek. They massed themselves together against me. God gives me up to the ungodly and casts me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease and he broke me apart. He seized me by the neck and dashed me to pieces. He set me up as his target. His archers surround me. He slashes open my kidneys and does not spare. He pours out my gall on the ground. He breaks me with the breach upon breach. He runs upon me like a warrior. You're like, dude, it feels like he's going down that hill and he's just like, this happened and then I feel like God did this and then these people came in and all this stuff. And he's like, I'm suffering pretty severely, Eliphaz. Look at all this stuff I went through. I went down this giant hill and I just face planted at the end. But look what he says at the end, right? Because he describes kind of how he feels. And then he says this in verse 15 through 17. He says, I have sewed sackcloth upon my skin, right, a sign of grieving, and have laid my strength in the dust. My face is red with weeping, and on my eyelids is deep darkness. He's tired, he's hurting, he's in pain, he's suffered. You're like, I could see how you'd feel that way. And then he says, although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. So Job says, I feel like I'm falling down this hill, getting beat up, and I'm at my wit's end, And then at the very end, he says, hey, I suffered, but my prayer is pure. I've suffered undeservedly. Now, again, Eliphaz's belief system makes no room for what Job just said. Like, it doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as undeserved suffering. But remember, as Job's trying to wrestle with these things and gain hope, it's like he's understanding there is such a thing as undeserved suffering, but we understand that undeserved suffering makes room for undeserved grace. Isaiah 53, verse 5 says this, and if you ever read Isaiah, it points to Jesus throughout the entire book. It says, but he, Jesus, was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. This is talking about Jesus, right? And if you read this, it says, but Jesus was pierced for our transgressions, for our iniquities. So if you think about suffering, Jesus suffered to the point of death, right? He was mocked, he was spit on, he was beaten, he was pierced to a tree, right, to the cross. And you're like, why did he do all that? It was because he was pierced for our sin, right? For our faults. And you're like, this idea of undeserved suffering with Job's life, it's even paralleled even greater by Jesus, who suffered undeservedly for what we've done wrong, nothing that he did wrong. And the reason why Jesus received undeserved suffering is so that we could receive undeserved grace. And so Job, like, he doesn't know this, right? Jesus had not yet come, but he's starting to get this idea that there must be some sort of mediator. There must be something to make things right. And so in this next section, we're going to see that Job, it's like he gets again this picture of a mediator who we learned about in chapter 9, but we're going to see how this hope is growing, and it's a little bit different. So in verse 18, he says this. He says, O earth, cover not my blood, and let my cry find no resting place. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high. My friends scorn me, my eyes pour out tears to God, that he would argue the case of a man with God as a son of man does with his neighbor. So remember in chapter 9, Job, he's like, I have this hope that there is going to be maybe a mediator. I hope there would be a mediator to come between me and God and make things right. And we understand that mediator was fulfilled in Jesus. We have that. But in this text, it's a little different. If you notice his language, he says, even now, like as he's suffering, he says, behold, my witness is in heaven. If you go to Job chapter 9, verse 33, this is what he said the first time he mentioned a mediator. He said, if only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together. It's like in chapter 9, he had hope of a mediator, but he's like, it'd be nice if there was one, but I don't think there is one. And it's kind of like, that's it, right? He's kind of sad. He's lamenting over that. But now, it's like his hope has progressed, and he says, there is a mediator, even now, and he who testifies for me is on high. He's like, my friends make fun of me. My friends hurt me. They scorn me. They laugh at me. But I know there is someone in heaven who will argue my case and will testify to the truth and not speak a bunch of lies about me that I deserve this suffering, but someone who will testify the truth and make things right between me and God. And so again, he's hoping in this mediator. And we understand, again, that the mediator Job longed for, we have in Jesus. Now, there's this picture on the screen. It's a blurry picture. We have the different blurs. So, sorry, the projector's, it's like kind of messed up, so you can't see what it says on the top, but it just basically just says these are different insects and animals that this is like their vision. And you see, obviously, in the bottom right, for a mosquito, I guess that's what they see. It's very blurry. And then it kind of gets more clear, right? And it's like Job on his journey of suffering and pain, it's like when he first started, he had somewhat of an idea of like the gospel, right? And this idea of undeserved suffering, undeserved grace. But now, it's like as he progresses through this journey and he's processing his pain, he's being honest, he's wrestling and all these things, it's like his vision is getting more clear. He's not there in the top left. Like, we have the full counsel of God. We understand who Jesus is, so we could see that clearly. But for Job in his time, it's like he started out in the bottom right, and it's like he's starting to make progress, and he's starting to see more clearly what all this is about, what the undeserved suffering, what his hope is, and it's pointing us to Jesus. Now, here's our third and final point before we conclude. It's this. So we talk about undeserved grace, which all grace is undeserved. And our third point is this, that our response to grace is urgent. Our response to grace is urgent. So, remember, when Noah was Job, it's like he's at the end of his rope, right? It's like he saw the grave and he's like, man, there's an urgency there. And so we're going to see the urgency that's there for us as well. But look at what he says in verse 22 of chapter 16. Job says, so he has all this hope, right? He's like, I know there's a mediator. I have hope. He's like, he will make things right. But then he says this. He's like, for when a few years have come, I shall go the way from which I shall not return. My spirit is broken. My days are extinct. The grave is ready for me. So it's like he has this hope, but it's like he's near the end of his rope. It's like he sees death and he's like, which if you read the whole book of Job, he lives a long life. He just doesn't feel like it right now. He thinks he's going to die soon, and he's like, hey, my hope is urgent. I don't have like 20 million years to just like have things be made right between me and God. He's like, there's only a few years. Like I need a mediator right now. And then he says this. He said, surely there are mockers about me, and that my eye dwells on their provocation. Lay down, he's talking to God. He says, lay down a pledge for me with you. Who is there who will put up security for me? Since you have closed their hearts to understanding, therefore you will not let them triumph. He who informs against his friends to get a share of their property, the eyes of his children will fail. He's like, God, I desire a mediator, right? Death is coming. Eternity awaits. He doesn't really know what all that looks like, but he's like, there's urgency. And he says, God, lay down a pledge for me. He's basically saying, God, make things right. If I have a debt and it's $10,000, pay for it and just make things right. He's like, I have hope. I'm responding, but I need things to be made right now, because if I'm going to have hope after death, I have to have hope before death. But he feels like death is approaching in his life. And then in verse 6, again, he kind of talks about his friends again. He says, he has made me a byword of the people, and I am the one before whom men spit. My eye has grown dim from vexation, and all my members are like a shadow. He's like, I've become a laughingstock. Like, people talk about me, and what they say isn't good. They're like, hey, Job, the reason why he's suffering is not because he's faithful, it's because he's faithless. And that's not true. And so then he says this. He says, the upright are appalled at this, and the innocent stirs himself up against the godless. Yet the righteous holds to his way, and he who has clean hands grows stronger and stronger. He's like, my situation where I'm innocent and I'm suffering, he's like, upright people who love God, honest people, they should be appalled at what I'm going through. Like, they should look at what I'm going through and their heart should break. But he's like, my friends, they're just looking at it and they're pouring salt in the wound. They're not appalled at what I'm going through. They're trying to give me reason to why I'm suffering the way that I am. And then it's like Job being a righteous man. It's like he has this burst of energy. And in verse 10, it's almost like he calls his friends back and like challenges them. He says, but you, to his friends, to Eliphaz, he says, come on again, all of you, and I shall not find a wise man among you. You can kind of see the conflict here, like between the friends. Like Eliphaz kind of like takes jabs at Job, and it's almost like Job's like, hey, why don't you guys come and approach me again? Because I'm not going to find any wise person among you. You think you're so wise, but what you're saying is not true, and it hurts. And then Job, he concludes with this. He says this. He says, my days are past, my plans are broken off, the desires of my heart, they make night into day. The light, they say, is near to darkness. He's like, I'm broken. There's a lot going on. And he says, my friends, you guys say, if I just repent, things will be good and things will be great. But they're not great and they're not good. And then he concludes. And at this very last part, it's kind of confusing if you read it. You're like, what does that even mean? But the key in understanding the last 4 verses is in the word hope. Now, in verse 13, there's a word hope, and it says this. It says, if I hope for Sheol as my house, if I make my bed in darkness. That Hebrew word hope in verse 13 is not the same Hebrew word for hope in verse 15. They're different words, but our English translates it the same way. The word in verse 13 is the word wait. He says, if I wait for Sheol, the realm of the dead, right? This idea that this is where people who die go. If I wait for Sheol as my house, if I make that my bed in darkness, if I say to the pit, you are my mother or my father, and to the worm, my mother or my sister, where then is my hope? That word hope is not wait. So he's basically saying, hey, if I trust in your like religious system, I don't have hope. If I wait for death, I don't have hope. He's like, if I just wait and I don't do anything and I don't, like a mediator doesn't intervene and I just wait for these things, he's like, where's my hope? who will see my hope? Will it go down to the bars of Sheol? Shall we descend together into the dust? And so for Job, he's like, hey, I'm at the end of my rope, right? He's like, I feel like death is there, eternity is waiting. He doesn't know what that all looks like. And he says, if I just wait and do nothing, and I just wait to be in the grave, he's like, I'm not going to have hope after death because I have no hope before death. And so Job is looking for hope, and he knows that if he's going to have it after, he has to secure it before. And he doesn't really know like where to look, right? He's like, I wish there was a mediator, but I don't know. But now he's like, I know there's a mediator. He's going to intervene. But it's like, you're just like, it's Jesus, but Jesus had not yet come, right? And so that's where we see that there's no hope after death until you trust in the one who defeated death. And so again, Job doesn't get this fully. He's in the midst of all this and all these things. But for us, we realize in the context of the whole Bible, we realize that for us, if we are to have hope after death, we get to trust not in just like some random mediator. We get to trust in Jesus, the mediator who sits at the right hand of God. And so I would just say this, okay? And then we'll conclude here. When we talk about responding to God's grace, right? We said it's urgent. Responding to God's grace is urgent. Grace is not just some like religious, mythical concept of like, hey, it's just grace and it's just love. It's like, it is love, but the grace of God is Jesus. Like, Jesus is God's grace extended to all of us, right? The one who received undeserved suffering. He is the grace of God extended to us. And when you talk about death, like when I talked about my grandma-in-law last year, it's like, that's a sobering thought, right? When you know people who have like passed away, or you're with people who are getting close to that, or you've ever gotten severely sick, you're like, it's a sobering thought and sometimes really scary. But death isn't as scary when you realize that someone actually defeated it, right? And when we're united with Jesus, the one who defeated death, death actually doesn't defeat us, right? We will pass from this life to the next. We'll enter through that doorway, but we resurrected with Jesus. We'll have new life for all of eternity. And so death is coming for us all. You're like, that's so exciting. Thanks for that message on a Wednesday night. But that's the reality, right? Like we're all going to die at some point. I heard this fact that said 99% of shampoo users die. Like, that's crazy, right? That means everyone. So death is coming for all of us. Eternity is waiting. Our response to grace is urgent because of those things. And there are only two responses to Jesus, right? There's only two. You either receive Jesus or you reject Jesus. And there's no third option. Like, you could think about a third, but there is none. And to receive Jesus, to receive and respond to the grace of God, is simply to understand that Jesus is the only one who can save you from your sin and the consequences of it. But then it's actually not just believing in that, it's trusting that he will do that. By laying down your own trust in yourself, in your good works, and saying, I trust in the work of Jesus to save me from all unrighteousness. And then we're like, that's how we're saved, by trusting in Jesus. So that's how we receive him. But the other response is to reject him. And sometimes when you think of rejection, you're like, yeah, when I asked that one person out, she was like, no, right? And you're like, it's an active no. But that's one way to say, hey, I'm saying no to Jesus. That's for sure rejecting him. But it's also saying nothing, right? Saying nothing and doing nothing, that's rejection as well. If God's grace is extended to you and you don't say yes, but you don't do anything, you're rejecting it. You're not receiving that. And so you can either receive it or you can reject it. And my prayer is that every single person in this room, a part of this community, Skagit Valley as well, the whole world would receive Jesus and respond to God's grace, because there's an urgency to it. Job wanted this hope. He didn't know what it was. He hoped in this mediator he knew existed in heaven. But friends, we actually have a mediator in heaven, and his name is Jesus. And so my encouragement to you is, if you're like, man, I genuinely want to receive Jesus, or I just want to talk about it further because it's urgent, please talk to me or one of your leaders tonight, and we'd love to talk with you about that. And so what we're going to do now, just briefly, is I'm gonna open this up. We're not going to break out in groups, so just as a group together, I just want a couple of people to pray. And here's what we're going to pray for, okay? We're talking about, if we're to have hope after death, we have to trust in the one who defeated death, right? You think about after death, that's forever, like forever. And we want people to have hope. We want them to have eternal life. We want them to know Jesus. And I guarantee you, most of us, if not all of us, know people in our lives, family, friends, etc., who don't actually know Jesus, who have not received him, but are rejecting him in their life, whether actively or passively. And so what I want to do is I just want to have a couple of you, students or leaders, just pray. Just pray that people that we know would receive Jesus, that they would have that hope because they're trusting the one who defeated death. And so I'll ask for a couple of volunteers, and I want you guys to think of actual people in your life that don't know Jesus, like who have not received Jesus. And I would even encourage you to write that down on your sermon guides so you can pray for them continually. But I'd love for you to write down a name and just think of someone, because sometimes we're like, yeah, I know people, but if we don't put a face to a name or like a name to it, it's kind of just like an abstract concept. And so you could write that down, pray for them, and if you volunteer to pray tonight out loud, you can even pray for your friend or your family's name. So I'll say this. Who in here, I just need a couple of people, just two, okay? Who would like to pray that people who do not yet know Jesus would come to know Jesus? Do you have anyone in here who would like to pray for that? Would be so bold. We got one person, Esau. That would be awesome. You can open us up. Who would like to close? We need one more person to pray. And if you're like, oh, should I do it? I'm kind of nervous. I don't want to pray out loud. Like, just be bold. I just encourage you. Just do that. Anyone? Guys, you want to do it? Okay. So we'll have Esau. You can open us up. And I would just encourage you, if you have people, you could pray for them who don't know. And Piper will close. And then after that, I will give our next steps so you can start us off. Amen. Well, thank you for praying. So here's the deal. Remember, we know that our faith, it is personal, right? If you have a relationship with Jesus, it is personal, but a personal faith is not a private faith. And so our job, we grow together in the gospel, but we also go to others with the gospel. We try to bring the hope of Jesus to the world. And so again, one of the practical ways that we do that is with this foster group home. And so I just want to encourage you guys, again, as you leave, make sure you take one of those cards, go out this week, just get one or two gifts for each of the kids. You don't have to spend more than like $5 or $10, maybe not even that, just whatever you can afford, and then bring it here next week. And this is a super cool way that we get to show the love of God to these boys at this group home who I hope they know Jesus, I don't know, but that they will understand and know and experience the hope of Jesus. So we love you guys. Thanks again for being here, and you guys are free to hang out. And if you guys want to learn a new game,